Thanks for being with us here on Morning Live. The Standing Committee on Public Accounts, or Scopa, has issued a letter to both the Minister of Health and Finance calling for an open and fair tender process for the storage and the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. Now, Scopa says that the tender process needs to be transparent in order to avoid the same scenario of maladministration and fraud that occurred when the personal protective equipment scandal in 2020 happened. Now, the PPE scandal had over 600 unlawful contracts and it cost the country billions of rands. The committee says that it is important to close the gaps and the loopholes that can be exploited by those who want to benefit from this pandemic. And the Chairperson of Scopa, Mkhuleko Hlengwa, joins us now to talk about this. Mr. Hlengwa, welcome. Thanks so much for your time.
An absolute pleasure, SK. Good morning to you and the viewers.
So, you know, when Scopa says that they want transparency and you are trying to avoid what happened during the PPE tender round, that, of course, is something that South Africans have already said. They've already said that they expect huge corruption. If you look at some of the opinions on social media platforms, etc. So Scopa has now called on executives to ensure that all these tender processes adhere to Note 3 of the National Treasury Regulations and, of course, also the Public Finance Management Act. But can you briefly explain to us what the Act actually says about procurement processes?
Thank you very much, SK. Look, there are probably three things, and then briefly I'll come to that question. One, obviously, the sentiment of pessimism is actually warranted on the part of South Africans, given what happened. And so, once beaten, twice shy, and that is what has precisely triggered the committee's intervention, which, of course, is ironic because in an ordinary, functional, perfect world where there's adherence to due process, we shouldn't have to actually make these kind of calls on the executive. But of course, the South African situation is wholly different to normality because corruption continues to be raging fire. And so I really think we do have to keep our eyes on the ball, and we have to continuously remind the executive and the administrators of their fiduciary responsibilities. The Constitution and the PFMA are quite clear, to answer your question, in that the processes have to be fair and transparent, and there are due processes which are therefore, ordinarily there. Why we have then actually sent the letter is that the Department of Health, amongst others, have applied for a deviation to National Treasury, which of course is warranted in law. However, deviations, in our view, are an exception and not a norm. And so we are concerned at the fact that the triggering of emergency spending protocols is what actually sets into motion to certain things being overlooked. And hence the call to say, you have to be at every material point of the process. So whether it's bid evaluation, bid adjudication committees, all those things will have to be done in the public domain. So whatever meeting will be had, it must be open to the public. We are saying this because, amongst others, we are expecting, because of the delicate nature and the desperation of the situation, for this to be handled in a manner which will actually inspire public confidence. And so we need the necessary skills, knowledge and expertise and capabilities from service providers. What has prevailed is, amongst others, companies being registered on the eve of the arrival of the vaccines. And so that puts at risk or into question whether these people will be able to actually fulfill these responsibilities. And so the fiscus is stretched far enough. We can't afford another stage of corruption. We're already dealing, as you already said in your intro, with over 600 contracts that we have to now sift through. The AG has completed the special report and the SIU as well, and we'll be going through those. So corruption seems to find fertile ground in emergency spending, and this is one such instance. And so that is why we are saying there has to be a public process. Of course, we are sensitive to the fact that there may be information which will have to be guarded for the sake of preserving the integrity of the movement and to prevent theft, amongst other things. But They cannot be that the process will be done behind closed doors from A to Z. Because what we don't want, SK, is that these things are done by the executive administrators. At the end, then they come to Scopa to say there was a problem. So in our view, consistent with the medical terminology, at this point, prevention is better than cure.
What can you do realistically, though, at this stage to prevent this from happening again? And by that, I mean a recurrence of what we saw with the PPE tender scandal. And also, you speak about plugging the loopholes. Which loopholes have you identified specifically that allowed for some of these dubious deeds and malfeasance to actually thrive?
Well, amongst others is the issue of, as I'm saying, this overnight or fly-by-night registration of new companies, where you've got specifications for tenders crafted to suit a particular company, and because these things are done behind closed doors, all you receive really is the outcome of the tender process without having had due sight of how the scoring took place, what discussions actually happened in the consideration of all these things. And so that is the major loophole here, is that the credibility of the people wanting to tender is called into question. The bid evaluation and bid adjudication committees themselves, in certain instances, have not been constituted correctly, and that has been cause for concern. Thirdly is the fact that there has been an inflation of prices insofar as all these tenders are concerned, and there's been tender splitting as well, wherein tenders will be valued below the thresholds requiring to go out on tender, so that they can be given to certain people. Or you'll find that person X will come in with 4 different companies with different names, and so on. So the public process enables us to scrutinize the processes from inception until their conclusion at all the material stages which actually takes place. The final point here is that we are calling on the law enforcement agencies because, amongst other things, the major deterrent is consequence management. And so they have to move with the necessary speed to make sure that there are logical legal conclusions to some of these matters. Amongst others, we're looking at the recoveries, the blacklisting of companies and so on, to sort of sift through the challenges which currently prevail.
You know, speaking of consequence management, one would once again be justified in, being a bit skeptical with regard to actually seeing any of that. For example, you look at the Department of Public Works and that 37 million rand fence that was erected, and still, yesterday they appeared before Parliament again, and it seems as though there's very little movement in terms of actually holding people accountable, Mr. Hlengwa.
Yeah, well, that is true. You see, the challenge here is that the network of corruption is so widespread, and we are dealing with historic matters. The issue you raised specifically of the Department of Public Works, it comes as no surprise that there would be a reluctance on their part to effect consequence management, considering that the company in question has got 19 contracts with the department to the value of 400 million rand. And so we are referring that already to the SIU for investigation. The second point is that we've already given them 4 weeks to bring these matters to a conclusion or to convince us that they are moving in the direction that it has to happen. The unfortunate tragedy of the South African situation is that consequence management was allowed to lapse for the longest of time. And therefore, when you call for it, to demand of it from administrators and the executive, it's foreign language to them. And so now we literally have to school people on the basics. And that is what is a challenge. But also, I think we must, whilst we are concerned and skeptical, derive a new confidence in that the SIU in particular is moving in a direction which inspires confidence. There have been developments which indicate that they are quite serious about these issues. You're looking at the costs, the recoveries of monies that have been lost because of some of the contracts that were irregular. But obviously, we have not taken steps which or strides which are large enough to allay the collective anxieties of the South Africans, and that has to sit heavily on our shoulders and be a daily reminder of the fact that the impatience of the people is running thin, justifiably so. But I think we are turning the corner, and we just need to quicken the pace.
Now, Mr. Hlengwa, have you received any feedback from that letter, the letters that were sent, either from the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Health?
No, we haven't. Well, the letter was transmitted to them on Monday, and so we will be making a follow-up. But this is a matter which we are taking very, very seriously, and will remain on our radar. And I am calling again on the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Health and the Acting Minister and the Presidency to attend to this matter with the seriousness which it deserves, because this speaks also to the integrity of their own process. If they want a vaccination rollout process which is beyond reproach, they're going to have to subject themselves to public scrutiny. And of course, I think they would want to avoid a situation whereby they are now receiving a proactive action step from Parliament which says subject this to a public process, so that at the end there is no excuse for when things go wrong. And the ball, as far as we are concerned, is now in their court, and they will be expected to provide a plan of action. And National Treasury should be appearing before us soon to explain how they are handling the request for deviation as well, which has been submitted to them, because they have to unpack it, and whatever conclusion they arrive at will have to be justifiable in law and in process.
So I'm just curious, because obviously Scopa will be closely monitoring what happens with the procurement processes, but those have already started. Just in terms of the procurement of the vaccines themselves, the first batch of which arrived on Monday. Then there is, of course, the issue of storage and distribution. Do you have any concerns around these already as things have played out, or are you just keeping an eye on it?
We are concerned, and this is precisely why we're making this call. The storage and distribution is at the heart of this, because that is where most likely you're going to have the loopholes and the challenges play out. We are, of course, awaiting the presiding officers of Parliament to make a determination insofar as to where the interministerial committee chaired by the Deputy President will be reporting, because that, of course, will form part of Parliament's oversight capabilities. But we felt it important that we need to trigger a parliamentary process which will set the parameters and guidelines of the expectations that we have insofar as this issue is concerned. And there will, of course, have to be collaboration in the interim across the relevant parliamentary committees, particularly health, finance, ourselves, and appropriations, to name but a few, in order for us to devise a process. But there has to be transparency generally and specifically on this matter. And I think that when the presiding officers have made a determination, the Deputy President and his IMC colleagues will have to appear before Parliament to unpack these issues.
And just the last one, our question of the day this morning relates to Parliament and its execution of its oversight duty. Do you think Parliament is effective in doing that?
Well, Parliament is going to have to undergo a serious process of introspection. If you look at the issues of the past few years, you look at in the context of state capture and the testimony coming out at the Zondo Commission. And of course, I think Parliament itself fully understands that the public is not happy. And there are political considerations at play here, which amount to political will on the part of political parties to ensure that our work rises above or transcends political divides and actually responds to the national interest. This is about duty and service, and is about the separation of the arms of the state. Parliament is not an extension of the executive, and therefore Parliament should re-entrench itself as the Constitution actually dictates and determines what our roles, functions, and responsibilities are. And so if, the public perception of Parliament at this point is one which should be of concern to us, and we have to respond to it. I'm quite confident that the presiding officers, as they finalize Parliament's strategic plan and turnaround strategy.
So just finally, in your assessment, yes or no, has Parliament, has it been effective in its oversight role?
Strategy, amongst other things, to respond to these challenges will actually... No, I don't think so. There is room for improvement. There's always room for improvement. But Parliament at this point is a work in progress coming out of the years of the past. So yes, there is definitely a lot of work that has to happen. There's no doubt about that. If we are serious, we will have to take the public criticism constructively, because ultimately we are the representatives of the people. So our work is clearly quite cut out for us.
Well, that's a conversation for another day. But thanks so much for your time this morning, Mr. Mkhuleko Hlengwa. And Chairperson of Scopa there, talking to us about Scopa's letter to both the Ministers of Health and Finance, and they are requesting a transparent procurement process for the COVID-19 vaccine in order to prevent what we saw with the PPE tender scandals. So we're asking you in our question of the day as well what you think of Parliament's oversight duty. Is Parliament effective in playing that role, that oversight role? At Morning Live, SABC. You heard from Mr. Hlengwa there, honest enough to admit that it perhaps hasn't, Parliament hasn't risen to the occasion. But we're going to leave it there, and we'll share some of those views later on. Let's take a quick break.